As we deal with the challenges that come from the gap that you initially described of the phenomenal and world and the world of consciousness, that these challenges invite us to somehow overcome and illuminate.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's why I use the word mundane, which I think is not quite the right word, but it's like we've got to realize it's always there. It's just part of, it's always there. You know, like you just have to just notice it. And as that noticing starts to go on more and more, then it'll build momentum. And it'll start to affect things. You know, I think one of the great tragedies of the world today is all the people who spend all this time trying to deal with all the world's problems without having a clue or without giving any attention. Maybe they have a clue, but they're not giving any attention to the space they create. I mean, think of all the COP meetings, the UN climate action meetings. I mean, a lot of the people care a lot, but you know, the space, it's sort of like if no one knew how to set a table for dinner. You'd have a bunch of food scattered all around and nobody would know how to organize it so people could sit down and enjoy their meal together. I mean, it's that simple. And I think ultimately it has to become that way, just little things. I like the, you know, one of the networks I find really interesting in the world is this Art of Hosting network. It's, you know, started probably about 10 years ago. Most of the people then were in their early, mid-20s. Now, of course, the ones who founded it are a little bit older. But I thought they were really onto something. You know, how do we host? How do we create a space where people will start to come in and not be immediately, you know, like this, or, you know, focusing on their agenda. They'll let their agenda go a little bit. They'll just relax. They'll enjoy one another's company. Another term that Bohm used to like to use a lot, koinonia, the Greek, you know, brotherhood or fellowship, this sense of fellowship. There's no good English word for it because it's not really a gendered term. But this is kind of just being together. We have to connect at that level, really simple, everyday ways of being together. Then we build our confidence.
The other day we were at a World Bank meeting, and one of the participants who came from a major global environmental NGO, she said they did a 10-year review on the strategies and so on, and all the main indicators point in the wrong direction. So all of them that they track. So in spite of kind of winning some of the battles,
right,
we are losing the war.
Right.
That's what she said. And that's how actually many people feel. So if you put yourself back into the shoes of someone who is in their 20-somethings and who is now kind of, you know, considering where to focus on, and what advice would you have for people who are, you know, more in the early stages of their change work? Where do you see, is it all hopeless, or where do you see interesting changes going on? And what advice would you give to people who currently are in their 20-somethings, in their 20s, as they consider their options moving forward?
Well, I think a lot of the most important leadership will come from people in their 20s and actually people 10 years earlier. I think it's easy to be disheartened. It's easy to see all the difficulties, as you said, so many of the indicators of physical, measurable indicators of well-being are on the whole going in the wrong direction. But then I think the two things you have to practice is very simple at one level. Where do I put my attention? So I see all this going on. It's so easy to obsessively focus. This is what our media, of course, is always trying to train us to obsessively focus on all the things that are going on that's bad. But that's a choice. You know, how do I learn to say, okay, great, I see all that, that's going on, but I put my focus here. And you always have that choice. Do you put your focus on what is in line with what you really care about, what, you know, where your love goes, not your fear, to put it really simply. It's easy for fear to dominate our focus. Very natural, there's nothing wrong with that, it's very natural, but it's not inevitable. You can also let your love dominate your focus. So focus on what really draws you, that opens your heart. You go, wow. And it doesn't have to be big. You know, this is the other thing to kind of keep in mind. The word global doesn't just mean big. It means everywhere. Right? So it can be right here. It can be something very small. But it's where my heart goes right now. So allow your heart to kind of lead you. And then just do exactly what you can do and don't worry about anything else. The world's got a lot of problems. It doesn't need my negativity added to them. There's enough problems. That's why people ask people like the Dalai Lama, you know, how can you be such a kind of happy person in the midst of all suffering? He says, adding my suffering to all the other suffering isn't going to help anybody. So I take it in and I put my focus where I want to focus. And I allow, do whatever I can do. I'm going to be in Bhutan in about 2 days. I'll be joined there by a very good friend of mine, an Indian, who you met recently, Debashis. I'll never forget one of the first stories Debashis ever told me. He's like 20 years old. He's very young. He's a university student. And through a bunch of friends and helping him, he got to do an interview with Mother Teresa. And he says, like, this is such a big thing. So he goes to Calcutta. He goes and visits her in her place, and she's living. And he's doing the interview. And he goes through all his, you know, he's a student. He's got all his interview questions. He goes through all of them. And then he kind of gets through those, and you know, she's polite and answering him. And finally, he's kind of got through all his interview. And he says, but there's a question I want to ask. You know, this is my question. And she goes, well, of course. And he says, how does a person do great things? And he said, no sooner had she told him that, and he asked that question, and she's, you know, doing that little thing the Indians do all the time. He said it was quite clear. She didn't have a clue what I was talking about. Like, this was my words, this was my idea. It had no meaning there whatsoever. She looked at him, and she said she didn't say anything. For sometimes she was puzzled. You know, who is this guy asking me this question? And then he said, she just finally just shrugged her shoulder, and she said, you cannot do great things. You can only do small things with great love. So that's, choose where to put your attention and do exactly what you can do. And just know that that's all anybody ever does. There's no big things, small things. That's like past and future. You know, they're just concepts. You know, and obviously our ego can get really attached to the big things, small things. Well, like, you're just doing that. You know, and I'm just, no. There's only things, and it's the spirit you bring, not the innate significance of the thing. I really do feel one of the great tragedies of today is people who are accomplishing so much less than they could because they're so focused on what a big thing they're doing. And they're not doing the small thing in that context with great love that could make a difference over time, because they're so focused on the enormity of the issue, which is to say their ego has gotten the best of them.
Wow. Doing small things with great love. What belongs to that probably, and you know, what might be kind of another, I'm interested in what you think about that. But when I just think about also our work, the other thing is you can't do it alone. You always do it in context. And there's like a few people, it's not that many, kind of, you know, a holding space kind of, or a core group or something. What is your thinking, and also your observations on that? Because, you know, mostly probably often in public the perception is on individuals, but the reality is always that it's, you know, there's like a social context. There's at least one other person or a few. So what is how does that dimension, what is your reflection on that, and what, you know, coming from that, what would you suggest to folks how to cultivate that?
Well, I mean, it's almost, to me, an oxymoron question. It's a logical question, how do you cultivate that? But here's what I mean by that. I think that's who we are. I think that's that part of us that is collective, that's born a collective, that's born in relationship. And because we've turned our back on it for so long, it sometimes can seem a little bit more difficult than it actually is. When you first started to frame that question, I just rushing through my awareness was just a sea of memories of all the extraordinary people I've been able to work with, which is to say tens of thousands. And why were they extraordinary? Because they were extraordinary, just the people. There was so much fun. And we enjoyed working together. It was really hard, but I really, frankly, Otto, can think of nothing I've ever done that I thought was very important that I did by myself. Nothing. And I think the challenge, because it's not always easy, but the challenge and the simple the delight of working together with others on things you really care about. I mean, there's no other way to do it. And again, it's a real tragedy when people are so busy trying to get it done that they're not paying attention to the relational space they create. Because the relational space they create is what will determine what gets done. So it's one of those great tricks that our consciousness can play on us, where we kind of seize defeat from the jaws of victory. We have the possibility of really accomplishing anything, but because we're so busy focusing on the thing and not on the relational space, we actually won't accomplish a thing. I often note, I'm very mindful when I go to meetings, Presence Institute meetings, soul meetings. We're always in these gatherings with lots and lots of people. I look around them, I've worked with that person for 20 years. And I first met them, in the 1970s. And I mean, it's like one big ongoing high school reunion. And I really come to delight in that because I realize how strong the relationships are and how they really go on forever. A good mutual friend of ours, Beth Chandler-Noah, who I first started working with in 1983 or 84, a long, long, long time ago. She's now kind of stepping down from leading some of the workshops. But we know that just because she wants to kind of move on at a different stage in her life, it won't make any real difference. Right? We'll see each other, we'll be in touch, we'll probably end up doing more stuff together. It's like it never changes. I was telling her this joke of Dr. Deming's where we were together. We were kind of, was this like, are we not going to see each other so much anymore? Because we've been leading these workshops together, for 30 years. And I suddenly remember this hilarious joke of Deming's. Dr. Deming was a real mentor to me. He was a founder of the Quality Movement. Many of us know him, but not so much now because he died over 20 years ago. And I remember we were doing this TV thing together where there was this very, very professional, like news anchor person facilitating. He had a little thing in his ear and he was very slick and he was really on top of everything. He was coordinating 6 different people talking and very smooth. But I was there, I wasn't watching on TV, I was with him. And you could see that his consciousness was really not focused. I mean, he was fielding all this stuff. And he was very, very sophisticated, I would say pretty mechanical at making it all seem smooth. But I could see he's starting to listen more and more. Deming was a great visionary. I mean, he really saw the possibility. When he started just the last 5 years of his life, the phrases he always used was transforming our prevailing system of management, which he thought was school, work, government, every organization governed by this crazy, what he called, system of management. Well, anyhow, this guy is starting to get it. I can see, he's like, and it's making him a little less functional, right? Because he's actually, so there may be like a 5-second pause after someone says something, which is like very natural, but in TV, that's terrible. Dead time is dead time, right? But he's starting to get into it, and so he's letting these pauses go. And so as I'm like 10 feet away from him, so I can see him right there. And finally, out of the blue, he asks the question that was in his heart. He turns to Deming and he says, how long will this take? You're talking about a transformation of our society. How long will it take? And Deming, who I think at that time was probably 92, he looks at him without missing him and he says, as long as you live, no longer. So you just start to get this orientation. Well, I'm going to do this forever. We have friends here, and that beautiful network of social relations that develops when you're doing what you're doing because you're doing it because you love it, and you'll do it until you can't do anything more. It'll go on as long as you live, no longer. It creates such a bond amongst people, and that's really potential. But the danger, of course, is our minds take over and focus on the task and what we have to accomplish. And then, of course, our anxieties dominate our attention, and it's all about fear. And then, of course, it becomes about manipulation. And once we start manipulating things and circumstances, the relational space is destroyed. Because relational space thrives, grows out of presence. Manipulation destroys it. And then you look at all the people trying to do all the great things in the world, trying to solve all these problems, fundamentally operating out of an emotion of fear and a strategy of manipulation. And you realize they're literally destroying the soil nutrients that could grow what they really want to grow. And those soil nutrients are the social space and the quality of the relationships. That's a tragedy.
So I know we are running out of time here, but I do have a closing question that relates to that, how to cultivate that space. And so that's about global movement building. So you have been in your work, kind of, part of your work, you're like in the academic space, creating methods and tools, and doing research around that. Then you have been involved in large systems change, multiple large systems change processes. But there's a third space, and the third space is that you cultivated a community of researchers, practitioners, and consultants in the context of the Society for Organizational Learning that really cultivate the use of these tools, the use of organizational learning and systems change tools. And that community of practitioners and of action research is now a global community, kind of self-organizing in many countries and so on. And in a way, how to move what I do locally, how to connect that kind of in a globally networked, collaborative space. That's a challenge that many of us have, and it's not that easy. It sounds more easy than it is. So I wonder whether, looking at these three domains of your work, I don't know whether you even agree that this is, but particularly at this community and this kind of global, how to hold the space for a different way of organizing. We all, what have you learned, and what can you, maybe what's a learning point or a piece of advice that the rest of us could be mindful of as we do engage in similar lines of work in our own context, in the various places that people operate from.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think those three domains are very evident to me. I think the community building is really the transcendent one in a way. I just personally, if I consider your question and say, well, what are the continual things that I need to learn? I don't need to do it. Those communities will rise because many, many people will do many, many things. And I think for me, letting go of having to do it, or having to, maybe a slightly more positive way to say, the letting go is really like the door, but it's like how to begin to hold. Once you've kind of gone through that, gone across that threshold, and you realize, I'm not going to do it, and I don't even have to do it. Where do you kind of allow your intention and consciousness to rest? I think that's something that I'm now very much engaged with. What does it mean to consciously create a space, a setting, a platform, whatever, for others to do things, and you to be basically invisible? We all know about creating space. It's always been a key common understanding of people in this work. Building a container, creating a space, building a platform. We use different metaphors and images, but we understand that. But I think there's always a question buried in that, like, where am I in this? And of course, I might be literally building the platform. I might be literally hosting a meeting. There's many different places you can be. But at some point, I think there's still some more subtle places that you could locate yourself. I think all of them are important. If you're going to create a community, you got to have people organize meetings. People are going to put a lot of time into creating that physical space, the gathering, the convening. Really important work. There's there's the building of platforms. The Presencing Institute website is a wonderful platform. I think it's a big step ahead of anything we've done in our respective networks over the last 20, 30 years. So that obviously took a lot of work and a lot of intention and all that. So that's kind of analogous to organizing a meeting. You got to really do that. And I think there's a lot of things like that where you're basically creating spaces where something can happen. Remember the old, Gandhi statement, like, be the change. And that, you start that creating space by just being the change. But I think there's further kind of steps. I don't know, these are probably a little bit different for everybody. But when I consider your question, to me, the question that kind of characterizes my life journey, that arc, has been, what's the next step for me in creating space? As I said, one time it was very much around convening meetings. I think it could definitely be around building platforms. But I see other people doing that, so I'm not even sure there's a role for me on that at all. It may be just learning how to connect with platforms that are being built, web-enabled platforms that are being built. But I think there's probably a couple more steps. I do know one thing. That journey is a journey of letting go. That, for me, I'm just speaking personally, the tendency, the deep habitual tendency, is to then do that and here's what I've got to do. And the premise behind that is if I don't do it, then it won't happen. And I think that's the real danger. I think that's accurate at some point. At some stages in those journey, if you don't do something, it won't happen. Fair enough. But at other stages, holding on to that little thought, what do I have to do in order for it to happen, may literally be the thing that limits you. Because the answer may be no, you actually have to consciously and intentionally, thoughtfully, and with real diligence, do nothing. Hold someone else in an image of what they're able to do, and do nothing else. So hard to say, but I know that's the journey. That creating space is always the common denominator in building communities, many forms of it, and then different things people have to do in order for different spaces to be created. At some point, maybe the doing becomes less and less. I don't know.
Thank you.
You're welcome.